Hello, and welcome to this online event, Ethical Leadership, Luxury or Necessity. My name is Steve Hardman, and I'm from the Gruyter Publishers, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today. This session is being recorded, and you'll find the video later on our social media channels and also on the Gruyter's YouTube channel. We're going to be spending about 40 minutes on a panel discussion, which will give us plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions or observations, please can you use the chat function. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our four speakers to you. Our first speaker, who in fact is the moderator, is Bernd Vogel. Bernd is Professor in Leadership and Founding Director of Henley Centre for Leadership at Henley Business School. Bernd's expertise lies in leadership and leadership development, and he has 20 years of global experience in research, educating, speaking and consulting with companies, business schools and universities. Bernd has published several books and is a series editor for de Gruyter's new series of leadership books, which is called the Gruyter Transformative Thinking and Practice of Leadership and its Development. I'm very pleased to be we have three panelists with us today. And our first panelist is Dr. Joanne Murphy. Joanne is currently a reader in leadership and organisational change at Queen's Management School, Belfast, but she's shortly moving to the University of Birmingham, where she will take up a chair in inclusive leadership. She is also a senior fellow of Northern Ireland's policy think tank, Pivotal. Joanne's research explores leadership and change and organisational development and political volatility, and she's written extensively on policing and security. Our second panellist is Ludabaka. Lou is Professor from Practice at the University of Michigan Law School and an affiliated scholar at Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Centre for the Study of Slavery, Resistance and Abolition. Lou coordinated US government activities during the Obama administration in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery as head of the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. As one of the US's most decorated federal prosecutors, Lou has investigated and prosecuted crimes of human trafficking, hate crimes, money laundering, and official misconduct. Finally, so last and by no means least, is our final panelist, Dr. Aidan McQuade. Hayden was Director of Anti-Slavery International from 2006 to 2017. He has previously worked extensively in development and humanitarian operations, including a 5-year period when he led Oxfam GB's response to the civil war in Angola. Aidan is a recognised expert on forced labour and trafficking, on which he regularly advises businesses and international and non-governmental organisations. Aidan is also author of Ethical Leadership, Moral Decision-Making Under Pressure, which was published by de Gruyter in June, and is the second title to be published in our new leadership series. Aidan also published a novel last year called The Undiscovered Country. Before I hand over to Bernd, I would like to say just a very few words about de Gruyter. De Gruyter is based in Berlin and is one of the oldest independent publishers in Germany, with a history dating back more than 270 years. De Gruyter is a leading publisher of academic content, and we also publish books for business professionals. In total, we publish more than 1,500 new book titles each year, and we also publish journals and various digital products. Everyone attending this session will receive an email afterwards with a link to the recording of today's event, and we'll also provide a code which offers a 20% reduction off the price of Aidan's book. So that's the end of the commercial, and I'm now going to hand over to Bernd.
Well, thank you, Steve, and also a very warm welcome from my side. It's a real pleasure to organize our digital event and have such an interesting group of people talking about, is ethical leadership a luxury or necessity? Reframing moral decision-making in the multi-stakeholder world. So our session is really about roughly 45 minutes of conversation amongst the three of us, plus myself, and then, you know, looking at a phase of 10 or 15 minutes of question and answers. So if you want to engage with our conversation, please add some comments or questions into the chat, and we will later pick them up and bring them to our panel. So that we also can hear from you and what you've noticed and what you like to explore in these themes. For me, ethical leadership is really close to my heart of my interest. And when we came together and thinking how we can frame, we ended up in this poll between, is it a luxury or necessity, or are we beyond a necessity maybe? And that's really what we'd like to explore with our group of experts from various reasons. And we'd like to start and bring in the three panelists with an initial question, really around, we often think about constraints or limitations, and what type of constraints or limitations do you think deter leaders, managers from making ethical decisions? And also, why do we want our leaders to be ethical in the first place? And maybe Aidan, you open up to these questions and share your thoughts and ideas.
Well, why do we want our leaders to be ethical? Maybe it's a good place to start. And I would suggest, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's because the future of the planet depends upon it. I mean, we're facing a variety of existential crises at the moment. And frankly, humanity's response to it, certainly the elite humanity's response to them in relation to climate change, in relation to human rights abuses such as forced labor and trafficking, in relation to the war in Myanmar, for example, has been underwhelming and insufficient for purpose. And I think a large portion of the reason for that is because there's not sufficient pressure from the rest of us on our leaders in order to get proper action going. And it's nice to think that everybody's voice is the same weight in the world. But one of the things I discovered very clearly when I was working for NGOs is that we had much less of a voice than business. And business probably finds that it has much less of a voice than others in government. So, but each of us can multiply each other's voices. And if we speak together with one voice, then we can begin to affect change and bring pressure for change. And if we don't do that, and don't do that with sufficient urgency, I mean, I don't have any children, but those of us who do have children should certainly be becoming very concerned about what their future holds, because it doesn't look good given the existential crises which are facing the planet.
Thank you, Aidan, that for kicking us off, and really with the question, why should we bother, right? It seems there's an implicit idea that ethical leadership and people in leadership positions should be ethical as a given, right? But it's probably important to explore first why that is the case. Joanne, what is your take on that question?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think it goes right to the very heart of what leadership is about, or perhaps more importantly, what leadership is about, as Aidan says, in this era of grand challenges and wicked problems that we're faced with. And it seems to me that there are two aspects to this. The first is how we actually engender leadership, what leadership means within this context. And I think the first issue around that is the idea of collective action. One of the things that really good leadership does is it engenders collective action, and that really creates change. And given the complexity of the problems that we face, that's very important. But then that itself leads to this incredibly important question about what leadership actually is, and where we draw those boundaries, and why ethics and ethical leadership matters, and then what that actually is. Because I think one of the things that we know from our experiences of leaders and leadership, and obviously there is a distinction in those two things, is that we have to really look at the compromises that leaders a lot of the time are forced to make. But even and I think one of the things that Aidan's book does incredibly well is that it explores leadership in the most difficult of circumstances, and it identifies for us that even in the most difficult of circumstances, leaders have agency to act ethically. That even when their back is against the wall and the situation is very difficult, there is room to exercise that sort of ethical leadership. And I think if people can do it in the most extreme environments, then we should be able to look at it in terms of detangling the mess that we've got ourselves into in so many other areas.
No, that's really, really helpful, Joanne, and we will explore a bit more the idea, when why are people pursuing the right thing when it's actually difficult, right? And because that's when it matters. But so Lou, what do you think deters people in leadership positions actually from ethical leadership and ethical decisions in the first place?
I think that some of it ends up being the tension between perhaps what we could say is the difference between leadership and management. I feel like management maybe is these things that, the profit motive, the advancing the interests of the group, protecting your country and the people that you're have been chosen or otherwise are responsible to protect. All of those things, end up, I think, in many ways being management. And then when people are doing it with an ethical basis, perhaps that becomes leadership. And I feel like maybe, looking at that as to the other part of the question, I think is so well put together because it's intertwined with this issue as far as the constraints. It feels to me like we're looking for in leadership, we're looking for predictability, representation, and inspiration. And so we want to know that somebody's ethical so that we can actually somehow predict what our leader is going to do or whether we want them to still be our leader. Representative in that it's that idea of tracking community morals, not simply saying, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect the country. It's we're going to do what it takes to protect the country within the context of our morality and what guardrails we feel comfortable with placing on ourselves. And then it ends up being inspirational because it's communicating those morals back to the people and maybe even pushing people into a place that they wouldn't have been otherwise. I think a lot of it comes down to Joanne's point about collective action. Why do we need leaders if we can all act collectively? Maybe it's that the leader is articulating what we're feeling. And when they do that well, and they take us to something better in ourselves, then we think of them as being a leader rather than just the head of government or a manager or, the head of a university or what have you.
It seems that, what I can take away as well is that ethical leadership, or the idea in ethical decision making, is from the examples that you bring, is really cut across all kinds of spheres of society, right? It's not a business question, it's not a governmental question, it's actually in our local communities the question. So by that it has huge impact. One of the core questions that again make me curious about the work that Aidan has been involved with, and that's where I like to go, it's kind of easy to do the right thing if we know what the right thing is, right? And probably that's in the multi-stakeholder world already difficult to establish, but it's to do the right thing is easy when all the others are doing it, right? So it's really getting interesting when, the odds are against you and you still have the sense that you're speaking for your stakeholders, that you should, you should keep the course, what you think is ethically right for your constituents. And so what can managers draw on? So keep doing, the right thing, although it might be unpopular, difficult, contested. And so, Aidan, do you want to kick off us on that question? And, Lou and Joanne, just go in, right? No need to wait for me to hand over as well. It's a conversation, please. But Aidan, really your territory and fascinating work.
What's core, I think, to ethical leadership is life affirming. That may sound a bit broad and nebulous. We can get more specific about that in terms of saying, it would uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It would uphold basic environmental standards about sustainability. And when it's making decisions, it tries to lead to that. It tries to refer to that. One of the case studies I write about in the book is when I was advised about a year or so ago to give some advice on what businesses should do in relation to Myanmar post the military coup there. And I don't know if the advice I gave was right or not, but the lodestar that I was looking to whenever I was preparing that advice was, what is the most life-affirming path that organizations and businesses could take in relation to Myanmar given the circumstances? And I think that's a key thing in ethical leadership. It's also about appreciating the complexity there, that there are different factors which can undermine, doing the right thing, which can undermine the best intentions for it. But I think one of the other things about leadership is that it should be erudite. It should be prepared to deal with those sort of complexities. It should be drawing upon a wide basis of knowledge and information and wisdom in order to try and think up solutions, think up life-affirming solutions towards the challenges which are facing us. So I think those things are core within it, and it should be prepared to be unpopular sometimes. Any leadership role usually deals with balancing competing claims on limited resources. You know, whenever Abraham Lincoln was knocking about, he's often referred to in some of the biographies of him as chief magistrate of the nation. And that was a metaphor which was used for the presidency much more in the 19th century than it is now. But I think that's a very good metaphor for leadership, because a lot of what leadership is about is making judgments against competing claims, against different advocates saying we should do this as opposed to that. And you're the one who has to say, well, actually, this and this is the reasons why. So being prepared to manage those sort of conflicts, prepared to manage those tensions, and be prepared to be unpopular, so long as you're doing that in the service of trying to be life-affirming, trying to do the thing which is going to provide most benefits for the maximum number of people in the most sustainable way possible. I think those are key to being ethical leaders.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Aidan. I think the one thing that I would add to that is just the existence of courage as an issue within leadership. You know, it takes a lot of courage, and it takes a very significant management of fear as well in order to take different decisions to the people around you. You know, and I know when I've been looking at how people manage and run businesses or manage and run organizations in environments of conflict, you know, one of the things that comes up again and again is how fearful they were, and yet how they still did the right thing. You know, how they stood up against what was physical intimidation as well as political intimidation. And I think we shouldn't forget about just the reality of the courage that takes, you know, and the centrality of courage to leading ethically as well, because it can, as we know, for very many organizations, be much easier to take a different road.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, I think that thinking about not just the personal, but also some of the structural, you know, I think about, and you know, with Aidan having done so much work on cocoa and in West Africa and Central Africa, you know, thinking about the people from 100 years ago that were really pioneering these things, you know, people forget that Morel, you know, was not only, E.D. Morel was not only uncovering a lot of the problems with rubber and everything else, but he was working hand in glove with William Cadbury to address, especially in the Portuguese possessions, but as well as Belgium, a lot of these abuses. And you know, I think he defeated Winston Churchill for a parliamentary seat before he was over with it. But you know, what's interesting to me when I think about that is here you have that blend of an NGO leader who becomes a political leader, but is working with a business leader. But the difference is that Cadbury owned his company, and you know, nobody gets out totally unscathed. There were issues as to, you know, was Cadbury doing some, you know, early greenwashing by funding some of these efforts? But we see that now, that people, you know, whether it's the folks at Levi's, whether it's the Marilyn Carson, who owns Radisson, whether it's the folks over at Mars, they're able to do some things that are different than their counterparts in the more corporate structures. Because they're able to get past that fear, you know, that fear of the next quarterly report or the fear of the stakeholders or whatever. They're able to actually say, this is my family's name on this company, and their own family ethics can then come in. So I just feel like that idea of, you know, kind of how do you surmount that fear and be able to go out and then execute is just so important. And then how do we unleash that for people who might not be working in a family company or who might not have the backing of a wealthy industrialist as they're doing their NGO work or their political work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the case studies I read about in the book is Ray Anderson, who did an awful lot of work with his company in order to make sure that it was a restorative enterprise, as he called it, rather than one which destroyed the environment. But he was very candid. The reason he was able to do that in a way which many other companies aren't was because he owned the company. It wasn't public, and he was able to set the terms of engagement with it. And I think in these sort of circumstances, we begin to see how our roles as citizens become important. Because yes, we have a role as professional leaders, but also as citizens, we have a role, and in that role, we can begin to think how we change the political economy itself, the terms, the laws, policies, and practices which govern the way in which economic enterprises are undertaken. And those two aspects of leadership, I mean, there must be two sides of the same coin for ethical leaders, otherwise we'd cease to be acting ethically. We are not acting with enough erudition within our leadership roles in order to have the full influence that we could have.
Aidan, if we act ethically on accident, are we still acting ethically?
That is an interesting question, and I might write another book about it. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say yes, because I'm feeling generous today. And oftentimes, a lot of the management choices that we are making our best judgment at a particular point in time, usually with limited information. So there is a bit of hit and miss about these things. The critical thing, I think, is that we learn from the choices that we've made. We assess what the impact has been, and we course correct if we've got it wrong. And so, yeah, if you've got it right by accident, by doing one thing as opposed to another, fair enough, take the win. Luck is usually the residue of hard work, but then move on and say, right, now how are we going to build upon this? How are we going to turn it into something broader, something more sustainable?
Can I think that's an interesting question. And I think probably from my view, it's the way how you deal with your accidental success of being engaging in ethical leadership, right? You know, if you claim, or if you say it's an accident and learn from it, from a reflective practice point of view, from how you define yourself. Picking up just a comment in the chat about, this idea that many work in systems where maybe people are willing, but the systems hold them back, right? As in the perception. And I want to add to you the question, yes, we want to be ethical. Yes, we want to be courageous, but a lot just don't feel that they have agency, right? They don't see that they can make a difference. And how, what are your experiences in view how, in this situation between system pressures and maybe a limited sense of liberties and empowerment, how you can then build still agency and thinking you can make a difference and life affirming or positive or ethical difference?
I mean,
I think there's a, sorry, Aidan, go ahead.
No, you go on, Joanne, please.
Well, I forgot what I was going to say now, but I think there's a couple of issues. I think the first is perhaps reframing a position that you've got, thinking again about the potential agency that you have in any situation. Undoubtedly, systems are incredibly difficult, and to some extent, the trick of leadership, if there is a trick, is finding your way through what is sometimes a very narrow path in terms of getting what you want or achieving the objectives that you're looking for. Aidan, obviously Aidan's book has a very interesting kind of picture on the front page of what I think is an ethical leader. Has the back of the book, sorry. I'm sure lots of you have seen it. An Irish political leader called John Hume. John Hume's a Nobel Prize winner. And in a very early stage of John Hume's career in the early 1970s, when the political environment was incredibly hostile to him, and he, at that point, I think most people in the Northern Ireland political leadership around the Northern Ireland conflict felt that it was a zero-sum game. There was really no way to move what was an incredibly intractable, divided society forward. Hume made a very interesting comment to someone close to him, and he said, in order to fix this, we need to make it bigger, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of the time people say, in order to fix this, we need to to make it smaller, we need to break it down. We need to try to, you know, to bring it down to its smallest denominator. But he had a completely different perspective. And what he did then was he went to Europe, and he brought the European Union into the conflict. He went, very importantly, to America, and he brought the weight of Irish America and Irish American political systems into the conflict. You know, and he built up extraordinary relationships with the Irish government in Dublin. So sometimes it is a different type of thinking. You know, that is quite unusual thinking, I think, a lot of the time for leaders, but it was enormously effective, and in the end led to what we know of as the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that thinking differently is part of the trick, but it's not easy.
And the problem then has re-emerged because the British government, let's face it, the English political leader, has wished to make everything smaller, just about themselves, just about their own prejudices, and has consequently struck at the foundations of the Good Friday Agreement, and are blissfully unaware of this.
Don't even understand what they've done.
Don't even understand. They would understand even less, but for the fact that a few of them might have watched Derry Girls a few months ago, and that ability of reframing the conflict in the way that Hume did is an example of that idea of complexifying the situation, of being erudite in relation to it. I remember listening to Hume speak in 1981, where he was talking about putting the Northern Ireland conflict in the context of Europe. Quite frankly, I mean, I was only 16 at the time. I had no clue what he was talking about, but it was prophetic in terms of how to move the situation on from this nasty little provincial, parochial war into something that then could be settled by political means. And again, if we look at some of the big problems that we're facing at the moment, like, for example, the migration crisis in the Mediterranean, or some of the challenges in relation to forced labor in other parts of the world, if we start thinking of those in broader contexts. So, for example, how do you develop an economy in Nigeria which is going to sustain the population of Nigeria and the climate of the world? Then you start thinking about things which kind of begin to address some of the underlying causes of the migration crisis, because people are being driven by these bigger issues, and we need to bring the problem that we're seeing, the most immediate problem, we need to understand what's the causes of them if we're to have any chance of solving them. And at the moment, people are looking too narrowly on these problems and consequently not finding satisfactory solutions to them. And too short term, as Lou was saying, because it's the next 3 months, the next year, the next election cycle that people are worrying about, rather than what's happening over the next decade or 2 decades that we really need to be thinking about at this point.
Aidan, you in the book, you set forth this cruciform of agency, which I mean, there's so many different levels on which I think it operates, but one of them at the beginning is even just saying that people have agency, and that you as the reader should think of yourself as having agency. But do you feel like it's at its best used when we're looking at those kind of historical situations and using it to analyze what people did and didn't do? Or could it be something that, you know, I or somebody else, if I'm going into work at the State Department, you know, at some point, you know, like take in with me, and, you know, am running my decision making through that type of a model? How do you think this maybe you should describe it better than I just did, to start with.
Well, there's two aspects to agency, and this is drawing on some of the finest research, I think. There's Emmenberg and Minch in 1997 with a paper called What is Agency?, where they were talking about very much the social aspects of agency, and said that it has a past, a present, and a future context. So what is going on within a particular workplace or community or organization has a past, a present, and a future. And these are the things that drive decisions and choices within that. And then Margaret Archer, in a book called Agency and the Internal Conversation, she talked very much about the personal aspects of agency, which again, a past, a present, and a future, but she called that me, I, and you. And so a lot of the decision making that you're making in the present is based on all of the stuff that's going on in your past. But these two obviously intersect. So there's me sitting in this conversation, sitting in my workplace, sitting in my community, and what's going on socially here interacts with the life I've lived up to this point and the values and thoughts that I've developed as a result of that. So I think whenever you understand that, you don't just have to go along with what everybody else is doing, because what everybody else is doing is not the whole story. It's not just what's happening in the social world as the whole story, but it's also how you think about it and the values you bring to bear upon that situation. And I tell various stories about people in the past who have made ethical choices and demonstrated ethical leadership based on the values that they've brought to a social situation. And the thing that I would hope people can draw from that is the notion that they can also do that. There was one story which I don't think I tell in the book, but some of you may be aware of a guy called Hugh Thompson Jr., who was, I think, the only American officer decorated in the My Lai massacre. And what he was decorated for was for saving the lives of 10 Vietnamese civilians. And Thompson was a Methodist. So before he'd ever set foot in Vietnam, he literally thought to himself, what does it mean to be a Christian soldier in this context? He had taken very clear understanding and ownership of his values. So whenever he saw his fellow Americans committing this dreadful atrocity within Vietnam, he thought, I need to act to mitigate this in some fashion that I can. And that's an example of a person who, in a situation where orders is orders and he was being told to support this dreadful atrocity, was able to take that personal value from himself and said, no, I'm going to change this. And there's other examples through history like that as well. I mean, Joanne talked about John Hume and how John Hume essentially recast the conflict in the north of Ireland by drawing from his own personal values and biographical history the notion that politics should be about something much more life-affirming. Politics should be about doing good for neighbours rather than justifying reasons for shooting each other. And those sorts of examples show how individuals, first of all acting alone, but then acting with others, can begin to reframe some of what seem to be the most intractable and difficult problems.
And that also sometimes means taking on your own. Sorry, Luke. Go on.
No, Joanne.
Well, I was going to say sometimes that kind of means taking on your own side as well, you know, and actually disagreeing with the people who, you know, who are supposed to support you. I mean, obviously, you know, famously Hume, parted ways with a lot of the nationalist and Republican community whenever they began to support violence, and he moved from a civil rights position where people were talking about civil rights to saying repeatedly that the first right is, of course, as we know, the right to life. You know, and that was in itself quite controversial. So sometimes it requires a break, you know, with people who you thought were your friends. That's the difficulty.
Just to finish that, I mean, one of Hume's lines of "you can't eat a flag," which I think was particularly opposite, because we're actually talking, some of us are in the UK at the moment, which is a country where both left and right have signed up to the notion that you can eat a flag, that the rules of economic gravity do not apply to this country, that the most important thing to do is to honor the results of a referendum that prioritized a whole set of fantastical promises which are unwedded to reality. And one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is nobody is facing down that line. And consequently, we're talking this really weird set of political developments happening within the country at the moment. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wonder if, and I want to circle back to this, because I think that not just Brexit, but a lot of other, kind of populist movements and populist thoughts that are, for many of us, seem very against the kind of interest of the country or against the interests of the group. But we keep coming back to people and examples who are drawing upon their faith. And, it's interesting because yesterday in my class on slavery in the built environment, we had a really good conversation on kind of Christianity, and Christianity as the creator and enforcer of the plantation system and the transatlantic trade, but also Christianity as the thing that was harnessed to do away with it, and Christianity as a beacon of hope and resistance on the part of Christianized Africans who then were tapping into that. Frederick Douglass, of course, was a preacher, although we don't think of him that way, but he was leading prayer groups out in the woods on the white plantation, and that idea of one of the students said that the slaveholders perverted Christianity, and another student who was a little bit more of a Marxist said it seemed like slaveholders were doing what Christianity does. But I was wrestling with that, thinking about that this morning, because for me it all comes from Catholic social teaching and being in a family and a church in my upbringing that put that into work, as far as the Salvadoran refugees and everything else. For Cadbury, assume not Cadbury the company now, but William Cadbury himself, it was he was a Quaker who meant it. The folks who own Levi's, that family lives their Judaism, and I think that that's one of the things that, at least in the academy, we often are maybe a little uncomfortable at admitting sometimes, that religion does often give people that moral place that they can act for, because we're so concerned, rightly, that religion also has been misused by the powerful and otherwise. So that notion of when the My Lai massacre hits, it's somebody who really had thought and lived his Christianity in a real way. So that, to me, it's tough to thread that needle. Maybe it's not an answer, it's more of an inquiry.
I think that's sorry, Bernd.
Yeah, I just I like to go back to organizations again, but I like to add one question, and when we spoke earlier, right, to prepare, and that's the question: who actually decides what's ethical, right? That's what you look at it from a faith perspective, with the entire continuum of ethical and unethical, but from a to faith you mentioned, but if you think about it, who decides what's ethical globally? Is it the informed North, right? And we make the same mistakes for ethical leadership that we've done for all the other leadership questions, right? Where we, from a certain corner of the globe, we decide what's right or wrong. So what are your views on that? Which is a question back, before we go into practice, to think about, who is it guided by?
My suggestion in the book is that a reasonable starting point is international human rights guidance and instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drawn up by people from North and South and all sorts of different belief positions. And unfortunately, environmental standards aren't so well enumerated in international law, but there's reasonable guidance there as well. But I think that the risk that emerges is that people can use any belief system to justify being a horrible, horrible human being. One of the analogies I make in the book is that we forget sometimes that if you ever watch Star Wars, both Obi-Wan and Darth Vader follow the same religion. One leads to the light side, one leads to the dark side, and from that emerges all sorts of choices. And it's the basis upon which you then use your belief system, whether that's Christianity or Judaism or something else, humanism, is whether you use that in order to look at other people as fellow human beings, as people who are created in the same image as God in Christianity, and say, right, that means that we're all the same with the same flaws and we should work in order to enhance each other. Or if you use it in such a way that you're going to say, you're not as good at this as I am, I'm going to use this as a basis to judge you. And obviously, we've seen that sort of thing happening in Christianity. We've seen that happening in fascism. We've seen that happening in communism and socialism, and every other belief system you wish to choose across the planet. There are those who use it for the life-affirming reasons, and there are those who use it as a basis of judgment. And I think that's what it begins to come down to in the end. Are you going to use this in order to try and empower and enhance other human beings, or are you going to use it to do them down?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think in the end, these things, you know, I really like your idea of life affirming, the life affirming nature of it, Aidan. And I also think it does come back to that idea of inclusion and compassion, you know, because I think whenever we see leadership, and we see good leadership, that's what we see. We see people who are inclusive and compassionate in sometimes incredibly difficult circumstances. And we understand how, you know, so often throughout history and still in the present day, religion has been used as an exclusionary mechanism rather than an inclusionary one. And yet when we look at, for example, if we're talking about organizations, something like Homeboy Industries, you know, which is led by a Jesuit priest, Father Gregory Boyle, extraordinary leader, you know, someone who puts love at the very center of what he does. And yet, unfortunately, I think quite unusual in some ways, you know, really kind of fascinating things. And I think still the largest tattoo removal organization in America in terms of gang tattoos, you know. Not, I think his slogan, slightly different to John Hume's, his slogan, I think, is nothing stops a bullet like a job. Which is kind of like you can't eat a flag.
Yeah.
You know.
You know, before we've got some really interesting observation comments in the chat, and I like to get to them, and I think they're challenging, and I love it. But you know, I wanted to ask you, and it's a bit of a difficult question, you know, but who inspires, and we touched maybe on some, but who inspires you as an ethical leader, so that people can take away and get an image, a narrative of, you know, those people that inspire you, maybe to take interest in the idea, but also in your practical life, in your community. So who inspires you? You know, if we start with Lou, and then we go to Joanne, and then Aidan.
I mean, it's so tough because, you know, the kind of who is the leader, right? The leader is, you know, everything from the person who decides to, you know, go and take care of the, you know, elderly lady in their apartment complex whose fire alarm's going off, and, you know, becomes somebody who says to everybody, we need to be taking care of each other. But, you know, we always default to the people who then end up on money, or the people who end up on posters on our walls, or this or that. And obviously, I have this poster of Abraham Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation on my wall. And, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that, because some of what we think about when we are inspired by these leaders is not just their ethical leadership, but for so many of them, whether it's Kennedy, or, you know, whether it's the Kennedys, whether it's Lincoln, et cetera, it's people who have given their life, or have eaten their life up in the service of the thing that they're leading. They've lost their health, they've lost their place in society, they've died young, you know. And I'm really interested in why we gravitate to them. Maybe because they're still perfect in our minds as far as their ethics are concerned. We don't know, post Civil War, Abe Lincoln, would he have become a despot? We don't know whether he would have, you know, like Grant, you know, started listening to the business community too much. But, you know, for me, I think it still comes down to, you know, somebody like Lincoln, who had failed so much in his life, and found himself in this situation and led the country to, you know, 4 million new citizens, and a promise of equity and equality, and did it through making some horrible choices, but all towards that notion of truly delivering on what this country claimed that it was about.
Joanne?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard to sort of identify individuals. Obviously, we have to some extent just in this conversation, and I know that there's a question just in the chat about some of the difficulties around John Hume, for example, who we've spoken about already. That Hume, you know, played a huge role in making peace, but in the process, you know, created great damage to his party and to his own health, and that is, of course, absolutely true. And I think there are, you know, I think I always feel, and I feel this very strongly, that leaders are just human beings. They make mistakes. They don't get it all wrong. There are sometimes circles that no matter how skillful they are, they cannot square. And they're people who take decisions. They decide what for them is the most important thing. For Hume, you know, it's a very good point, particularly in terms of his party. But Hume knew what was important to him, and that was creating peace. And he would have said that he did, first of all, he said two things. One, he didn't care who took his seat. He didn't care who took his seat as long as the conflict was ended. And secondly, that losing the party was worth, even if it only saved one life, it was worth it. You know, and that again puts that idea of human life at the very center of what is important in our society, you know. But I mean, I think beyond that, you know, people like Jacinda Ardern, in terms of her leadership through sort of COVID, you know, we mentioned kind of people like Gregory Boyle, you know, making an extraordinary difference to the lives of individuals. And I think for me, that sits at the very center of ethical leadership.
Thank you. Aidan, any thoughts?
My wife probably keeps me honest. I think she's maybe my ethical leader.
Great answer.
We can all testify to that, all of us who know her and you.
I dedicated the book to my parents. I call it my first ethical leaders. I think there's a lot to that. It's I mean, we can learn from Lincoln and Hume and Ray Anderson and some of the Dalit activists and African leaders that I write about in my book. But in the end of the day, it's the ones who get you through the dark night of the soul, I think, are the ones who are closest to you. And making sure that they're part of the leadership conversation that you're having in relation to, you know, your choices as a citizen and as a professional leader. I think that's very, very important in order to sustain what you're doing.
And I think that's really interesting. And I'm just picking up, you know, this distinction between, you know, we look at these well-known people, right? Also with the assumption that we actually know what they're doing and thinking, which I think is always, for me, you know, really difficult. But Lou made this, you know, but there's day-to-day ethical leadership, right? You know, day-to-day acts of being ethical, long-term, short-term, and I think that's often probably bigger resource to learn, you know, or as least similar strong for organizations, for individuals, and maybe you also have more access to understanding what's really going on in their decision making, right? And then that relates more to you. And the other, you know, where Joanne, you came in, is the question whether we should think about ethical leaders or actual ethical leading. And by that, actually understand that these are never individuals, right? You know, and you know, all they are, you know, for a certain time, but then often there's actually multiple people involved, you know, supporting, endorsing, or challenging, right, as well, and keeping in the straight and narrow, right, you know, to an extent. So I think then we open up the idea and really look at, you know, I think you call that creating momentum, you know, for these ideas in itself. And I think then we also less reliant on the individual, right, with all our strengths, but also shortcomings, you know, which we do have. Now that's fascinating. I like to pick up a couple of questions and observations, right? And I you know, probably don't get to all, but there was an interesting a question, you know, and people might. And it's all, you know, if we look at ethical leadership, it seems we always end up with really dire conversations, right, in dire situations, you know. But that's where we can make a difference. But you know, I think one person, Caroline, brings up the idea, you know, if we look back a few months ago, you know, P&O ferries, right, sacking 800 people. For the greater good, you know, that was the argument, right? You know, you save jobs, you know, you save families, you know, in a way, by, you know, in a way saying, okay, so that means for 800 people, that's not so. So is it, you know, how can we, you know, and then you speak about life affirming, right? You know, but maybe for some it is, maybe for some it's not. So is there any way to open up this dilemma, or you know, in these cases? Any commentary, you end?
I mean, as I say, people can use all sorts of language and all sorts of belief systems in order to justify some really horrible things. It's sometimes the certainty of being right is the greatest excuse possible for the doing of wrong. So I think one shouldn't take things on face value to say, well, we're doing this for the greater good, because really, are you? I mean, which greater good are we talking about? Who is the ones who are benefiting most from this? Is it thinking about, can we sustain the employment, the decent employment of this number of people? Or is it about, yes, we want to make sure that an even smaller group of people and shareholders are going to get the profits from it? And then you're into a question of really being able to assess, well, what is the more life-affirming choice in relation to this? The whole point of the cruciform of agency is that you are operating within social constraints, some of which may be about the need to maintain profitability or financial viability of an organization whenever you're making decisions. And sometimes there's just no getting away from that. But I think that one needs to be testing it against that question of, well, am I doing the best? Am I doing the most life-affirming possible thing here? Or am I simply going through a way that's going to satisfy the bring greatest, individual benefits to me, or satisfy the most powerful stakeholders who are sitting on my shoulders? These are the sort of questions to ask. So in relation to P&O, I wouldn't make a definitive answer on that, but I would say there's ways to question that, and there's ways in which executives who are in those positions should be thinking about the decision-making processes that they're faced with in the lead up to any harsh economic or financial decision as well.
Well, and this is maybe where I'm going to follow Dr. Murphy and hold up the book. So,
Yay.
I think that one of the things that, it doesn't necessarily matter what underlying belief system or underlying culture, people are in now in a way that it used to, because we are in a global world. We're in a global world that has these international norms, whether at the UN or in regional fora or what have you, of governance, of finance, of how to do business, et cetera. And many of those, grew out of checkered pasts, whether colonialism or otherwise. But, we've had, certainly in the post-war era, something that maybe transcends some of those specific cultural and differences, such that I think that we can now talk about there being a global ethic that we can test ourselves against. And I really like, and the reason I have held up the book is because, Hayden, you came up with this code of conduct for ethical leaders that is kind of matches almost every culture in the world and almost every religion in the world, as far as taking responsibility and choosing life and being fiscally prudent, yet defaulting to what the community needs, et cetera, are. Those 6 kind of ethical guidelines, unfortunately, by the time our business leaders especially get done with their training, they've in many ways replaced all of their own personal ethics with Porter's 5 factors, or whatever those things are, 5 forces. And then they start thinking that, people are inputs. And the bottom lineism that they're trained in, that is the highest good, whether it's measured short-term or long-term. And they might think when they step out of their business world and go home and live their other ethical life, that they're being ethical, but then as soon as they get into the business, back into their business space, and they start applying what they learned in business school, those 5 forces then take over, and that's the morality with which they're taking on the world. So I feel like coming up with a new way for them to be thinking, and then not just on the business side. Obviously, it's easy for us to gravitate towards that, whether it's a government-owned business or a private-owned business. But I think it's replacing what we're teaching people as to what the highest morality for people in business or security side is not safety or the bottom line. The highest morality is choosing life and being on the side of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are incredibly important points. You know, I am just when you were talking, Louis, I was thinking about Joe Slovo, you know, the kind of anti-apartheid leader, and he famously said, you know, the question isn't whether a system works, but for whom it works. And I think if we look at something like P&O, it would be really good to look at it a bit more deeply and to see really who those decisions work for, because I suspect, which is not quite as straightforward as saving the company, you know, saving shareholder value possibly, you know, as well. So I'm not trying to say that these are easy issues, that they're easily dealt with, or that they're not some very significant business challenges in this, but at some point along the way we have got very badly lost, you know, and there is a responsibility, you know, as many of us know, in business schools as well, to begin to rethink what we're teaching people about what matters in organizations and what organizations do.
And I think, you know, being part of a business school that involves, you know, a broad discourse, and I think we're seeing a shift.
Oh,
right?
I do too.
I think we see probably similar shift from, you know, washing, right, to substantial change, right? Because we see the similar phenomena, and time will tell how deep education has changed, how deep it has changed, who decides what education, who decides about education and all these questions, you know, because we created change from those who were not for the change. So, and I think we see similar transformative change or not in many cases. I'm conscious of time. I just like to add, you know, there were more comments around, and Joanne, you picked this up, you know, the cost of being an ethical leader, right? This is, you know, and that's a fascinating piece. My colleague, Luaka, he looks at leadership in crisis regions, and she looked at that as a leader, you personify the identity of your group, which is good, but that's also the problem, because you're stuck in your identity of the group. So the idea is then actually stepping out, right? But that comes as a cost, right? So how do we, you know, and that reminds me of the question of the bigger, right? They want to do the bigger and have probably a bit of credit because you personify your social identity of those people around you, but that might then be the end of your being endorsed. There's questions around what can those around ethical leaders can do, right? Let's call them followers. Language is never great, you know, endorsers. I think that's something to look at further. And I know that Aidan has a few pointers in his book around that. We spoke a bit about culture, right? Lou said, you know, in a way we have you know, ideas that seem to be global, right? You know, I'm pretty sure some people might still challenge that, right? You know, in a way, but maybe there is some hope that at this level of human rights, you know, that there is actually agreement, despite, and maybe the group that signs up is getting bigger, at least, right? While obviously some don't really sign up, as we just learn every day, but that, you know, it's an interesting, and then again, who defines that is something that was brought up from a cultural question. I just like to put these, you know, we don't probably have a time to together, and that relates to this, you know, and you make a great point on how you know what is ethical and where are the different thoughts, but what happens when people come together with different ethical understandings, right? You know, and how do you navigate these situations, you know, where we're all right, you know, like I'm always, you know, so, and then how does that work? And just to give you a bit of an idea. Well, and the final question, right? And I just leave it hanging there, right? You know, John, and I need to, John Bazarget, and how I get the name right, asked, you know, so how do you understand the leadership of the late Queen Elizabeth II, right? You know, which is and I think we leave it there with a cliffhanger, you know, and the only thing that I will say to that, it's quite interesting the decisions that have been made, how to report and start to think about her impact, right? And I think we will see different evaluations or considerations in the next month or years beyond those of the last 10 days. And I actually think that she would appreciate that, you know, instead of just a one-sided so far. So these are some of the comments that we found in questions. I hope you know, first of all, thanks so much for the Gruyter of organizing ourselves today. Thanks so much to Aidan, Joanne, and Lou, really to make time and guide us through this conversation. I try to, stay out of the way as much as I could to listen to those that really have a clue. And I can only, encourage you, for those who are interested, reach out to us, right? Have a look at the book. It's stimulating, it's practical. There's a lot that organizations and, all kinds of institutions and individuals can take away. And keep reflecting on that, right? That this is a journey, right? This is not a switch, this is long journeys with all the ups and downs. But I hope that, Aidan's work and Joanne's and Lou can add to some of the positive momentum that we find. And thanks so much. Steve, would you like to have any further thoughts?
I'd just like to thank you, Bernd, for leading the discussion. It's been tremendous. And thanks to Aidan and Joanne and Lou. I feel we could have probably gone on for a second hour. It was a really, really great discussion. And thank also the people, everyone for attending and the engagement with the questions in the chat. There's some really good questions came in, so people really got engaged with the discussion today. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.